Good morning, everyone. We're going to open with a brief guided meditation that Vivekananda gave in his Raja Yoga classes. It's called a pratyahara, which usually begins before we enter into our meditation given to us by the Guru. So let us sit straight in our chairs, back not resting against the back of the chair, but spine straight. Feet, if you're seated with your feet on the ground, firmly placed on the ground. So let us begin by taking in three deep breaths, breathing in deeply and exhaling completely. Picture the mind as a calm lake stretched before you. Let the mind drift. See how thoughts come and go as bubbles rising and breaking on the surface, becoming ripples that are ever widening circles. Make no effort to control your thoughts, but watch them. Follow them in imagination as they rise, break, and float away. I am not the mind. I can see that I am thinking. I am watching my mind act. Hold fast to the idea. I am the witness, watching my mind drift. The mind is not I. Watch the mind as a thing entirely apart from yourself. Identify yourself with God, never with the mind or matter. Be the witness. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace. So this experiential patch before our topic is something we can go back to during this talk on yoga, the yoga and science of happiness. Happiness is a quality of the mind. We have sattvic happiness, which is a harmonious state of mind, rajasic happiness, which is happiness of a sensual and interactual nature. And then we have tamasic happiness, complete dependence on something outside of ourselves. So it brings us happiness. It's contagious. Whether it's making others happy, sharing happiness with others, or borrowing happiness from others. For the yogi and the Vedantin, happiness is about mind management. You've heard this term before. Our senses may act as inroads, but essentially, happiness is a cognitive experience. Our cognitive experience determines our state of mind. And our philosophical understanding on the nature of the world is what elevates our quest for happiness, where we can find it and where we cannot. Swami Vivekananda tells us, we are caught, though we came to catch. We came to enjoy, we're being enjoyed. We came to rule, we're being ruled. We came to work, we're being worked. All the time we find that, and this comes into every detail of our life. We are being worked upon by other minds, and we are always struggling to work on other minds. We want to enjoy the pleasures of life, and they eat into our vitals. We want to get everything from nature, but we find in the long run that nature takes everything from us, depletes us, and casts us aside. Swami Brahmananda also said, no matter what riches you may possess, no matter what prospects you may have for living a happy and prosperous life, you still will not find lasting happiness. Pain follows pleasure, and every action brings its own reaction. Nothing lasts but the one true happiness, which is to be found in God. So our philosophical premises guide us in our pursuit of happiness. First, our relationship to material things, and second, our relationship to our ego. What then are the levels of happiness? They're dependent on what comes from the senses. That's not to say that the yogi pays no attention to the senses. No. In fact, the yogi's senses are heightened. Now, that may sound like a contradiction, but in fact, they see, taste, and smell to a heightened degree because the mind has been trained in the art of concentration. Concentrative attention can be brought to bear on anything the yogi chooses. In other words, it can also heighten the senses. For example, Swami Brahmananda, who was the disciple, the spiritual son of Sri Ramakrishna, the first president of the Ramakrishna order, asked his attendant why he had added onion to a dish that did not call for it. The attendant protested that he had not. But Maharaj insisted that he check the utensils. And the attendant found that onion had been accidentally added to a dish because the knife used in preparing the dish had not been properly washed. That is a degree of attention a yogi has. The second level is that happiness comes from thought. It may be sublime, uplifting thought. It may be happiness that comes from the elevated humor of a spiritually advanced or insightful mind. And I have to say, living in the convent and monastery for over 50 years, humor is something that is like chicken soup to the soul. It's something that we just enjoy. Sri Ramakrishna was full of humor. Sarada Devi told others that Ramakrishna used to have great fun with the young monks. Narayan and Babaram would roll on the floor in side-splitting laughter. Once at the Kasipur garden house, when Sarada Devi was carrying a bowl of milk for the master, she felt giddy, fell, and dislocated her ankle. Sarada Devi shared that when the master heard of the accident. He then said to Babaram, "Well, Babaram, it's a nice mess I'm in now. Who will cook my food and feed me?" Ramakrishna was then ill with throat cancer, and so Sarada Devi used to cook for him. She would cook farina pudding for him and bring it to him in the upper story of the Kasipur garden house. She related, I had a nose ring in my nose then. The master touched his nose and then made a sign of a ring by making a circle with his finger in order to indicate me. He then said to Babaram, can you put her, making the sign, in a basket and carry her on your shoulder to this room? And Naran and Babaram were convulsed with laughter. Swami Premananda remembered how he would entertain his monks by imitating a dancing girl, placing one hand on his waist and moving his other hand about. Again, through humor, tales, and parables, he would explain to us the most intricate philosophies which were confusing even to scholars. Swami Vivekananda also had a marvelous sense of humor, as did Swami Brahmananda, who would sometimes play practical jokes on his brother monks. One of his favorite jokes was to have some fruits or sweets placed beside a disciple who was meditating. When the disciple had finished his meditation, he would find his favorite dishes laid out before him. And later, Maharaj would ask, well, did you get the fruits of your austerities? In this way, the monastery was full of fun. The third level is happiness that comes from intellectual absorption, making connections between deep intellectual concepts. And I'm sure most of you are professional people, and you have experienced that joy that comes when you are intimately connected with your work. When this happens, a person is in a state of flow, which we'll discuss later. The fourth level is the happiness that comes from giving service to others. Seva means service, serving our beloved in the form of the other. Service is the expression of loving another as one's own self, one's own higher self. What happens? We shift the center of our focus then from giver to receiver. The final goal surpasses empathy. We feel fulfilled and the recipient feels elevated. By selflessly serving others, we feel we're serving the one self in all. So when this is done in a genuine way, the result is palpable. The fifth level is meditation. And most of you are meditators, I'm sure, so you know what we're talking about. When we're absorbed in something expansive and elevating. In our quest for all of these levels of happiness, we realize ourselves are generating the happiness. And as we mature in our quest for happiness, we realize that our happiness is independent of any tangible object. It is there, inherent within us. It comes from a higher awareness within each of us. And as we develop our spiritual quest, we become more and more aware that happiness is a state of mind. It grows and develops within us to the degree we're able to pursue a spiritual life. We also realize the tools we need to cultivate happiness. Martin Seligman devises a happiness equation. Happiness, he says, is equal to pleasure plus engagement plus meaning. Now, as spiritual seekers, we strive to become grounded in a systematic spiritual practice that brings us positive emotions and joy, which our close family members and friends support and even participate in. It can improve a marriage. It can improve relationships between friends. It can improve our feeling of well-being. and the contribution that we can give to our society. So what is that joy? It's a deep sense of satisfaction that comes from engagement in a spiritual routine that we have the capacity to maintain and which has meaning for us. Now, some of you have been recently initiated, so you know what that routine is, something that is given to you by the Guru. It may include a worship or meditation in the morning and evening to bookend our day. Now, one great Swami told me, he said, when you bookend your day, what happens? And I'm not talking about 5 minutes of meditation at the beginning and 5 minutes at the end. When you can book it up to 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening, what happens is that there is a current that begins to flow throughout the day, and you feel it. It elevates you. It elevates you through any difficulties you have during the day. Our Guru has instructed us to read holy books. That helps. Definitely helps before we enter into meditation. We can't just sit down, plunk ourselves down, and grab the mind and force it within. No, we have to create an atmosphere first, and that comes from holy company, which we get by reading holy books. So we may try to sustain our meditative morning meditation with a silent reading. We can begin it with a silent reading and end it with a silent reading. In fact, in our convent in Santa Barbara, we understood from Swami Pravrajika that after meditation, it's best not to communicate with others for about a half an hour, to spend about a half an hour in silence. We may then try to keep holy company at least once a week by visiting our temple, Vedanta center, or church, which you do. Engagement to a meaningful routine supports and sustains our happiness. So if we find we're in a routine that's not bringing us joy, change the routine, make it joy-filled. Furthermore, it's crucial to develop an inner capacity for self-reflection. What has caused any unhappiness I may have felt in my day? And that pratyahara that you did at the beginning of this talk is a very, very useful way for you to watch what's in the mind as a witness in a scientific way, and then to dissolve the negativity into the lake of the mind. Why? Because you have control. You are the witness. You know you are not the mind. There is a higher mind watching the lower mind. You have control. In other words, we develop a self-disciplined life. That includes a spiritual routine in our life, which feeds our own spiritual aspiration and needs and our nature. What is good for me may not be good for you. It may not even be appealing or good for any other person. But I know that I cannot live without my self-prescribed spiritual routine if I wish to be happy. But then what about the rest of the day? How do I protect that meditative mood I have established in the morning so it won't unravel in the workplace or during my day-to-day duties? Vivekananda tells us in his lecture, The Secret of Work. And he himself said that his karma yoga was his greatest contribution. He said his karma yoga, as in his karma yoga manuscript, filled with lectures on karma yoga. Work like a master and not as a slave. Work through freedom. Work through love. There's no true love possible in the slave. Selfish work is slave's work. And here is a test. Every act of love brings happiness. There is no act of love which does not bring peace and blessedness as its reaction. So in other words, the medicine is love. Vivekananda continues. When you have succeeded in loving your husband, your wife, your children, the whole world, the universe, in such a manner that there is no reaction of pain or jealousy, no selfish feeling, then you are in a fit state to be unattached. He goes on. Do you ask anything from your children in return for which you have given them? It is your duty to work for them. And there the matter ends. In whatever you do for a particular person, a city or a state, assume the same attitude towards it as you have towards your children. Expect nothing in return. If you can invariably take the position of a giver in which everything given by you is a free offering to the world without any thought of return, then will your work bring you no attachment. Attachment comes only when we expect a return. So in other words, if we suffuse our work with the meditative spirit established in our morning meditation, we take that meditation with us by offering our work to God instead of accepting the results for our little self. Our happiness, our joy is untainted. We also learn how to protect our happiness and avoid those circumstances, individuals, or activities that cause a rebound of mental pain, suffering, anxiety, and happiness. We can follow Sri Ramakrishna's simple prescription for happiness. He said, repeat God's name and sing his glories, and keep holy company, and now and then visit God's devotees and holy men. That's the food that we need to sustain that happiness. What now is the neuroscience of happiness? Every subjective thought and experience we have had determines the objective neural pathways in our brain. That is why in recent brain research, scientists have taught us about the neuroplasticity of the brain. It's possible for us to mindfully rewire our brain and thus create and build a more positive climate in the mind. Call it happiness, loving kindness, or well-being. This is proof that our conscious thoughts matter. And to know what our conscious thoughts are, we have to practice that pratyahara and meditation. We have to get in tune with what's going on in the mind. So what inhabits our capacity to rewire our brain? Our overusage of social media, for one. You're all aware of this. We're all aware of this. On the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry webpage, we can read for ourselves. Smartphones have transformed the way we communicate, learn, and entertain ourselves. However, this omnipresence can lead to compulsive use and a sense of dependency. Now, we're all subject to our smartphones, even those of us in the monastery and convents. It goes on. The constant stream of notifications and updates can create a sense of urgency and a fear of missing out, leading to increased anxiety and stress. Furthermore, the excessive use of smartphones can interfere with sleep, which is crucial for mental health. Social media platforms, while enabling us to connect with others and share experiences, can also contribute to feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem. Facebook, for one, studies have been done. The tendency to compare oneself with others and the desire for validation through likes and comments can lead to a distorted self-image and feelings of worthlessness. Moreover, studies have shown a correlation between heavy social media use and depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicidal ideation. The platforms are designed to be addictive, using algorithms that feed the users content based on their preferences and interactions, keeping them engaged for longer periods. But you already know all of this. This information is out there. And yet our smartphones are so addictive that we can't stay away from them. To maintain and thrive in happiness and well-being, again, we're reminded of the tools we need to develop and maintain. It's crucial to develop the inner capacity for self-reflection. That's absolutely essential. The ability to ask ourselves what has caused any unhappiness or anxiety I have felt during the day. Another obstacle to the serenity and joy we receive from a spiritually based meditative life is what is called the U-shaped learning phenomenon. The U-curve learning paradigm shows us that with any skill we cultivate, there is a tendency after some time to skip our practice. Maybe one period of the day, then the next day, then maybe for a period of several days, and so on, until we become self-reflective enough to assess how our mind is sabotaging our practice. And this goes really strongly with a meditative practice. It's easy to say, oh, I'll skip it this morning. And then I've got things coming up in the evening, and tomorrow morning I'm too busy. And then eventually you're struggling without it. Then with determination and a renewed commitment, we're able to get a hold of ourselves and return with regularity to our practice. So neuroplasticity of the brain means that we can remake our brain to behave in any way we wish. What we have unmade, we can remake. That is the capacity of yoga, to rewire the brain by developing, for example, yoga-based habits based on the yamas and niyamas. These do's and don'ts create an ethical and spiritual guide. They create guide rails that prevent us from falling into a muddled, unkept life of irregular habits, despair, and disrepair. They are the spiritual guidelines that lead us into creating spiritually uplifting samskaras that can, in fact, rewire the brain. That is the hope. So with the yamas, we strive to abstain from harming others, telling untruths, even in jest, abstaining from stealing, even in thought, and try to cultivate pure thoughts and refrain from selfish actions. With the niyamas, we strive to lead a pure life, be content with externals, but practice divine discontentment. I haven't reached the goal yet. Let me continue to strive. Let me continue to strive. Introduce some spiritual structure into our daily life. Daily study of the scriptures and the practice of devotion to God according to our Guru's instructions. So these preliminary disciplines set us on a path to rewire our brain, one day at a time. They act as neural guide rails to keep us from falling on our journey up the mountain path of Yoga Vedanta. By reinforcing the yamas and niyamas, in other words, the yogic neural pathways in our brain, by changing our behaviors and reorienting ourselves to a higher goal in life, we create a positive, elevated mental climate of focus. So in anything that we do, mental or physical, mundane or profound, if we can bring the mind into focus, what in Sanskrit is called ekagrata, we receive what is called the joy of concentration. It is a felt joy. In meditation, the quality of that focus is called dharana, concentration, and leads to dhyana, meditation, and brings with it a palpable joy. Outside of meditation, the term flow was coined by the Hungarian-American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who studied the creative process in the 1960s. He found that artists in a flow state would persist at their task regardless of hunger or fatigue. Some characteristics of flow are intense focus, to such an extent that one becomes completely absorbed in an activity and pays no attention to distractions. Now, I'm sure that has probably happened to all of us. There's a loss of outside awareness, a loss of a sense of time and oneself, along with the feeling that one's actions and awareness are merging. And along with these feelings, one feels an intrinsic reward and inner joy. When a spiritual aspirant stabilizes oneself in this process and perfection of concentration, it is called ekagrita. In yoga, it is a self-sustained state that comes with the repeated practice of meditation. When the mind is trying to concentrate, it flits away, and then it is brought back. And again, it flits away and has to be brought back until it is steadied for 12 unbroken seconds. Then it receives what is called the joy of concentration, a felt joy. But when it is steadied in meditation for 12 times 12 seconds, roughly 2 minutes and 24 seconds, an aspirant feels a more intense joy and qualitative difference in that state. That is meditation. And that state doesn't come right away. It has to be worked on. It has to be developed by daily meditation. In that state, the will is still active, but we don't feel we're trying to meditate. The mind is suddenly just flowing toward the object of meditation, and with it comes a sense of joy and peace. The mind becomes, as it were, stuck on the object of our meditation without any effort on our part. We feel that it is being pulled there. It becomes then totally saturated with that object of meditation, and one feels blissful. In other words, if we can develop the power of ekagrita in our life, throughout our life, we will unlock the yoga and science of happiness. Now we come to the Yoga of Vedanta paradigm that provides us with a spiritual insight into developing happiness. In yoga, there are 3 steps to happiness, which Pravrajika Divyananda Prana beautifully outlines in her book, The Science of Happiness. First, calm the mind in a focused mode. Second, develop contentment by emptying the mind. And third, shun negativity. Calm, contentment, shun negativity. In Sloka 133 of the Yoga Sutras, we read, the feelings of friendship, mercy, gladness, and indifference in regard to objects happy, unhappy, good, and evil, respectively, pacify the citta. Now, this sounds like, oh, that's simple. No, this is really profound. In order to have that peaceful expression on our face, we have to have that peace within ourselves. Now, there are 4 conditions: Sukhatma, Dukhatma, Punyatma, and Apunyatma. Sukhatma. What is the condition to cultivate to get the maximum benefit of this interaction? We cultivate the virtue of Maitri, friendliness towards all. Even those people that we dislike or are annoyed by. We must cultivate this to find peace within ourselves. We must be at peace with ourselves in order to construct a spiritual life. If we're constantly restless within, we'll never be able to restructure our spiritual life. So before trying to advance in yoga, the teacher reminds us of the attitudes we should be cultivating, but are not yet at home with it. We must strive to cultivate karuna, compassion. When we observe a dukkha, sad state of mind in other people who are suffering, that ennobles us. The more we're ennobled, the more at peace we'll be. Mudita means absorbent, receptive. For example, yoga practitioners must concern themselves with absorbing ideas on how to manifest the divinity already within ourselves. This attitude of absorbing, learning, receiving, being keen to learn and to retain what is learned is ennobling. Upeksha, indifference. Say we find ourselves in an atmosphere that is not ennobling, but is demeaning, even belittling, then it's better to avoid such situations if we're not strong enough. Indifference does not mean being holier than thou, but being one with everyone. Otherwise, what nobility is within us will ebb away. You know, reminds me, there's so much going on in the news today. When I went to Bellarmine at that time in the 1970s, it was forbidden to have newspapers on the Mount grounds. And we see for ourselves what happens to our mind when we check in on the news today. So again, if we can monitor our behavior in that regard, inform ourselves, but not fixate on the news, then we're apt to become happier. So in order to strive to know oneself, we have to protect ourselves. So we must not expose ourselves to malign influences. And this is just common sense. In Vedanta, there's the model of the Panchakoshas, the 5 sheets that helps to shake off our illusory sense of self and reorient ourselves into understanding, who am I? The author, Brahmaprana, explains the technique. The Panchakosha model is telling us, in fact, quote, we are a unit of pure consciousness functioning through a body-mind complex. We must understand that the definition of ourselves, according to Vedanta, is consciousness functioning through the body-mind complex. This is our actual identity. However, we never think of ourselves in this way. When we use our body and mind as instruments to achieve our goals, we are unconsciously positing the Vedantic dictum. It is essential for our well-being to remind ourselves. According to Vedanta, the consciousness, which is the Atman, radiates into the intellect. That is how we become intelligent. It radiates into the mind, and that is why the mind becomes conscious. It radiates into the pranamaya kosha, the vital sheath, and the body, and that is why they become enlivened, as it were. We are identified with the body, mind, intellect, and think we are these only. We are that consciousness, Vedanta tells us, which is the nature of pure existence and bliss absolute. If, through yoga, we can learn to stabilize our attention through meditation and through Vedantic techniques such as Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, hearing something holy, meditating on it, realizing it, refine our attention. We can probe the nature of the mind as well as a consciousness that illumines the mind and gives light to the body and to our senses. This is what develops in our path of Yoga Vedanta. Consciousness is that which our awareness is operating. It is that in which our awareness is operating. It is the source of all our perceptions. Consciousness is the fundamental awareness in which everything else functions. We can experience this in some degree by deeply looking with calmness and concentration at the world around us, as illustrated by the inquirer in the Kena Upanishad, who asks the big question: at whose behest does the mind think? Who bids the body live? Who makes the tongue speak? Who is that effulgent being that directs the eye to form and color and the ear to sound? The Kena Upanishad then responds with an axiomatic truth of our being. The Supreme Self is the ear of the ear, the mind of the mind, the speech of the speech. He is also breath of the breath, and eye of the eye. And you were coming closer to that, being the mind of the mind, in that opening guided meditation. A simple pratyahara to watch the mind by the higher mind. And who is watching the higher mind? That which cannot be seen, the self. The Upanishad goes on, him, meaning the Atman, the eye does not see, nor the tongue express, nor the mind grasp. That which is not comprehended by the mind, but by which the mind comprehends. Know that to be consciousness, Brahman. That which cannot be seen by the eye, but by which the eye sees. Know that to be Brahman, the eye of the eye. That which cannot be heard by the ear, expressed in words, but by which the ear hears. Know that to be consciousness. Know that to be Brahman. And that which is not drawn by the breath, but by which the breath is drawn. Know that to be Brahman. These are verses really meant to be meditated upon. So in this existential inquiry, we use our eye sense to understand what our true I, the source of our happiness and bliss, is not. We are left with an intuitive feeling. And with the help of yogic meditation and Vedanta techniques of nididhyasana, rigorous logic, contemplation, and assimilation, we can then turn our steps toward the inward discovery, the inward journey of self-discovery. Thus begins the process of rewiring our brains. To decondition ourselves into thinking we are simply a body-mind complex, and recondition ourselves into understanding who we truly are, the Atman, one with Brahman. This takes the guidance of a qualified guru, because the path is trodden only by realized souls, and a strong dose of emotional intelligence, which comes from religiously and systematically building our ethical and spiritual core, our foundation, through the yamas and niyamas. We must first condition and purify our body-mind complex if we wish to penetrate deeper into spiritual life. We must wisely invest our time in study, meditation, and holy company in order to successfully recondition ourselves and support the rigors of our inward journey. Now we come to changing our habits. And the first is understanding the mind. Every vritti, conscious thought we think, or emotion we feel, lodges itself in the subconscious mind as a samskara, a mental impression. So you can imagine how many millions and billions of samskaras you have in your mind at this point in time in just one life. Well, add that to previous lives. And so all of that is going on. The older ancient samskaras are deep in the mind, but through yoga, we can pull those out. Obstructions come, and as we meditate, we can see those obstructions. And then through our razor sharp surgical knife, we can slice them out. So over time, that samskara may come to our mind again as a memory or replay itself out as a trigger, as to an unexpected reaction to a present event in our life. For example, if as a child we witnessed domestic violence in our home life, there's a strong possibility that as an adult, we may also imitate the violent acts we witnessed or cower unnecessarily when we observe them in others, reliving the feelings of helplessness we felt as a child. Any act or even intimation of violence may trigger these childhood samskaras. That is why, as spiritual aspirants, it's important for us to be vigilant and self-aware enough to face past negative samskaras. Get help if you need, psychological help if you need. And with the help of our guru, we learn how to process and attenuate them so that they can no longer obstruct us on our road to freedom. Vivekananda learned that in his youth, when one day in Benares, he passed an area of wild monkeys and they attacked him, howling and shrieking. And the faster Vivekananda ran, the faster they came, until a bystander called out, "Face the brute." Vivekananda turned and faced the monkeys head on. They stopped, bewildered, and slunk away. Vivekananda said, that is the lesson for all life. Face the terrible, face it boldly. Like the monkeys, the hardships of life fall back when we cease to flee before them. Cowards never win victories. We have to fight fear and troubles and ignorance if we expect them to flee before us. So what happens in moments like that? Vedanta tells us consciousness is all-pervading. It shines on everything, including our thoughts. The more we struggle to develop our thoughts in spiritual life, the more luminous our conscious mind becomes. We become more susceptible to such teaching moments in our lives. Our consciousness illuminates our mind in daily mundane matters, in our daily education, as well as in the subtle lessons we are meant to learn from even our most ordinary experiences. Vivekananda tells us, each one can grow and strengthen his personality. This is one of the great practical things, and this is the secret of all education. This has a universal application in the life of a householder, in the life of the poor, the rich, the man of business, the spiritual man, in everyone's life. It is a great thing, the strengthening of this personality. Now we come to the levels of the mind. Beneath the conscious mind lies the subconscious, and beneath the subconscious is our unconscious mind. Therefore, in order to change and control the contents of our subconscious, we as yogis and yoginis must learn how to mindfully reprogram our conscious mind by actively engaging in our spiritual life. The operative word is active. This is yoga, the knowledge of knowingly reprogramming our neural pathways through our conscious daily acts of bhakti, devotion, karma yoga, viveka or discrimination, and yogic mind control. Throughout our spiritual practice, day in and day out, we experience the beauty of this internal habit-changing mind, because the mind itself is not conscious. Consciousness is illuminating the mind. Therefore, the self-aware aspirant is able to see the contents of his or her mind, just as you did in the beginning of this talk. See the changes in the mind, and even, so to speak, talk to the mind as though it were an object, which it is, because science tells us that which we can perceive is matter. The mind is matter. And that's well worth remembering. So what is the connection between the brain, mind, and consciousness? Yoga Vedanta tells us it is the difference between the hardware of the brain and the software of the mind. Then added to that is consciousness itself that throws light on the mind and allows us to observe the workings of our software. So how can we experience this? By consciously stopping the thought process of the mind and striving to remain as the witness. Be the witness. We can tell ourselves this throughout our day. We can step back, take in a deep breath, be the witness. This is a state of ekagrata. We might be able to understand this yogic concept better through the preliminary concept of flow given by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. It is a psychological state of complete absorption in a task. One loses a sense of time and space, and as a consequence, there is experienced an inner flow of joy. Another deeper, more intense flow comes to the yoga practitioner when one's vrittis, thought waves of the mind, are silenced and brought to a standstill. This takes effort and repeated practice. What happens when that occurs? The aspirant's force of concentration has generated such a habit that that force gets the practitioner's psyche stuck there. It becomes effortless, and one has the experience of a throbbing, living interaction with that symbol of the divine. The symbol falls off, and what remains is I, the capital I, and the divine. So success in yoga leads to union, and that union leads to bliss, the highest form of happiness. As Vivekananda explains, if you meditate on any truth with steadfast devotion and concentration, you will see that the mind is more and more tending onwards to oneness. In other words, taking you towards the realization of the absolute existence, knowledge, bliss. Along the path, we experience episodes of this divine flow to the degree or lesser degree, to degrees lesser than the absolute, but nevertheless deeply absorbing and satisfying. Swami Pravrajika, disciple of Swami Brahmananda, deconstructs for us this type of experience of divine flow. He said, Ananda has two meanings. One is happiness, another is love. But these are identical, because where there is love, there is happiness. And where there is happiness, there is love. And this happiness is not what we call the happiness we experience in the world, because that comes and goes. That comes in contact with objects and things. But this happiness is without contact. And this love is without contact. That is the very nature of the soul, of the self, of the Atman. So this union that comes through meditation or through grace ultimately brings supreme happiness. But even before we arrive at this pinnacle, there are milestones along the way. The aspirant develops a profound sense of satisfaction, fulfillment, and inner joy just knowing that he or she is on a noble mission, that one's life is becoming more and more centered around a higher goal, a union with the nature of love itself. And the proximity of that love, the warmth of that fire, leads us onward and satisfies us with a joy that no other form of happiness could. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.